Okay, we'll dive in. Welcome, everyone. I'm Bob Carlton with Lisa Bain Carlton of College Matchpoint, and we are so grateful today to welcome our colleagues Jed and Ginger to the conversation. Jed is a nationally recognized expert on all things standardized testing, and Ginger is a really respected and trusted partner who has worked with us for the last couple of years. And we are just grateful that all of you carved out some time to spend with us this afternoon, talking about all manner of things standardized testing for juniors. A couple of housekeeping notes, and then I'll turn it over to Jed. We are recording this webinar, and we will share with you tomorrow the YouTube link and the presentation materials that Jed is sharing. And two, standardized testing, as we've mentioned so many times, is oftentimes the biggest topic of questions for parents and students who are juniors. So please use the Q&A box. Ginger and I will officially try to wrestle that as it comes through. We can't say that we'll answer everything, but we will try to tackle it. But without much further ado, Jed, welcome, and we're grateful to hear from you this afternoon.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate that. Let me put up my presentation, and I will do a slideshow from beginning, and we are good. Okay, so we have an hour, and we're happy to be here today to talk about all things testing. With Ginger and myself, we'll do a little tag team, some of the slides and the Q&A. And it's an interesting time with testing, and it always is. It's one of those things that's ever changing, ever shifting. Perceptions of testing, it's definitely been very active in today's discourse. I'm reading about it more in The Economist last week or so, and people have opinions about it. It's been, it's maybe contentious, but schools are taking sides and kind of using the data to inform what they're doing. But it's definitely political and interesting in terms of access and resources and fairness and equity and merits, all these big topics which we're debating as a country. So today we'll talk about testing, what it means, where it's going, how to, as juniors, how to think about that. So one of the quotes we get, and I'm sure Bob and Lisa have also heard, tests are optional. And part of it, testing, except for a few states, has always been your choice, whether you test or don't test, unless it's required for, graduation requirements. But typically, forever and ever, the top schools in the country, if you wanted to go there, testing was required. That was just part of the application. If you didn't have it, it wasn't, it wasn't going to work. But this year, we have a lot of schools in the country. The majority, about 3/4 of the schools in the country, are test optional. The pandemic has turned everything upside down in the testing world. But little by little, we have some parts. The dust is settling a bit, and we're starting to get a sense of how things are going to look. A little more clarity now than there was 8 months ago about where things are. But ultimately, in this world of test optional, students have choices, and that's part of it. You're more in the driver's seat in terms of if you prep, how you prep, if you send, if you don't send. So there's definitely more agency, more choice. But with that choice there are more questions. In a world where you must submit, there's this real discourse. And this year we're seeing more and more students, and the previous submission cycle, using more strategy, where I'm going to send here, I'm going to withhold here, or I'm going to prep hard, I'm not going to prep at all. Definitely these interesting thought experiments of whether you want to pursue testing or not, submit or not. And right now there are 4 primary testing policies, but 3 are really more predominant. Test required. There are a few schools, a few states, a few schools in that place. Test optional, which is the majority. Test flexible, which was a bigger deal before the pandemic, and then test blind, where testing is not going to factor in. Even if you scored a 36, no one cares. So we'll talk about that in the different places. So test required, they're not going to read the application without a test. It's not complete. It's part and parcel. Your grades are good, your rigor is good, but without a test score, they're not going to give it a proper read. So, and also be mindful that these days there's a little, the third bullet is about self-reporting, that historically, when you applied, you would spend the money to have your score sent. Now, the majority of schools out there, they're letting you self-report. I got a 27 on this date, 29 here, the breakout of 31. And then if you're accepted, you spend the money for the actual score report. It saves parents and students some money, which is a good thing. And many colleges are on board with that. But test required was the number one, it was the dominant position, the default position for most schools, but not right now. The pandemic has changed that, and it might never go back. More than likely, it won't go back to that position. Testing is still required by certain states. Florida never dropped the requirement. Part of it has to do with scholarships, guaranteed admission, merit scholarships, all these things. So, Florida said, whatever, find a way to test, and they never dropped the requirement. They're one of the few states, and there were concerns, would it really change their application rates, but it didn't. The flagship schools, University of Florida, my parents were Gators, and FSU, they didn't drop their numbers at all in the pandemic. And then this year we got big news for Georgia, for Georgia UGA and Tech and Georgia State. The entire Georgia system is now requiring testing for this cycle. So that was a big deal. It's the flagship state schools are very competitive, and we learned, you may have learned this from Bob and Lisa, that UT, that's where my sister went to Austin. They are now going to be requiring testing not for this cycle, not for the next round, but for the year after. And so high school students who apply, it's going to be fall 2023 freshman applicants and beyond are going to have to have test scores. So they're still waiting for the dust to settle on the pandemic, but they've signaled that testing matters, and they want it. And so that's going to be interesting. I don't know yet if the entire state system, how they're going to move, but the flagship, UT, and when and that's been a real question. Is there going to be this discrepancy between the flagship schools and everybody else? Because the lower schools, they're not as selective. Is testing more meaningful, more important for the schools that are highly selective? And how is that going to play out? But UT signaling this, it does give more clearance for other state flagship schools to do the same thing. As we have these highly respected public Ivies making these moves, saying testing matters for us. And for that matter, even I'm waiting for the Georgetowns and the Yales to come back and say we're requiring it after things settle in. At Yale, we've heard something similar, that test scores are the single best predictor of performance for freshmen at Yale. And so testing still does mean something, clearly. And so there are going to be schools who go back to requiring it. That's coming soon. Now, one of our friends and colleagues here in Atlanta, Rick Clark, he made a comment at the HECA conference, which is a national gathering of college counselors. And he said, when it comes to test optional, do not count on the South. He said, and he is privy to many conversations. He's head of undergrad admissions. He's talking to his friends at Alabama and South Carolina and the Carolinas, Tennessee. He said, the South, it's, his sense was things are going to be coming back. And so the Carolinas, Alabama, and Texas. So, and we'll see what happens with other parts of the country, like Oregon. They said we're test optional and we're committing to it. Other places, the Northwest, New England. But it seems like, where we are, that testing is going to be trickling back into place. And we'll know more with every cycle of admissions. But, it seems like this is going to be a trend. So when it comes to optional, and again, that is 3/4 of the schools right now are optional during this pandemic time, that they will consider your application as complete and perfect and intact without a test score. You can get in without scores. It's really your choice. Same thing as APs. APs are not required. You can submit, it's intact without it. If you want to send your scores, you can, but it's up to you. It's your choice. And there's a question of how much weight, how much advantage there is. We'll talk about some of those numbers soon. And so if you send test scores, they become, a key part of that application process. They'll become part of the conversation. The kid has a, 3.8 unweighted, 7 AP, this and this, got a, a 1350 SAT. It's part of the conversation as they look at you in terms of the academic strength of the applicant. And so this is, right now this dominates. You choose. And then this number is actually higher. It's over 1,700 schools for this cycle of admission. And then there are many schools who've been extending their test optional policy. UT is on there, but many schools, Princeton, Penn, Barnard, and most schools honestly have continued this year. And a few have said we're going 2 years, Amherst, Penn State, Illinois, Williams, Pitt. They want, because they're looking at data. And part of it, you only have now 1 year of data of a class of students who came in without test scores. And they want to see more data. They want to see what happens. Not only how does this change the input, how does it change who applies, how many folks apply, but also then the outputs, how those kids do. Can we look at the kids who had test scores and didn't? Are there differences in course taking? Are there differences in performance, in GPA, in attrition? Do we see more kids without test scores and good grades not leave and transfer out freshman year, sophomore year? And many schools will wait a full 4 years to really, some of these pilots are 3 years, they're already 1 year in, and they're going to have data which is much more robust and bigger samples to see what kind of trends, and then how much do we get by having testing requirements. But then there are certain schools who already believe in it. Part of the research, like here in Georgia, there was research out of UGA a decade ago, and they were looking at the correlations between test scores and grades in college, and looking at other variables, other factors in their regression. And they were looking at testing, they were looking at GPA, and they found that it turns out testing was a better predictor of freshman grades at UGA. But the best prediction you can have is when you combine testing and GPA. That's when you get more strength. And that's the same thing they found actually at the University of California in their research, in their big, huge report. They're like, testing actually is predictive and helpful. It didn't change their decision, but ultimately the data is meaningful and important. And I imagine UT is looking at its data very closely when it's making these kind of moves. So one of the big changes that when schools went test optional, the schools that are selective got a lot more kids applying. And that wasn't surprising to any of us in this space. Whenever a competitive school goes test optional, more kids apply. That's just how that works, because there are many kids who naturally select out of a pool if they feel like they don't have the chops, they don't have the grades or the scores, and they self-select out. When test scores become not a thing or not required, then they're more inclined to apply. So more kids apply to these top schools. And we've seen a lot of schools that were tough get very tough. Very selective numbers. There's a few here, UCLA, Duke, some of them, NYU, where they're posting these big numbers after they went optional. And the selectives just became more selective. And schools like Emory went from 19% to 13%. Duke almost double, 11.4% acceptance rate down to 5 and change. So these numbers, they're tough when you're coaching a student, talking to your kids who they're excited about Duke, and now it's like Duke accepts 1 in 20 students. That's, you want your kids to fall in love, but part of it is talking about the math and what that means. And even if, your kid did everything right, when it's 1 in 5, 1 out of 20 kids gets in, a number of those kids did everything right. And so it kind of just changes the calculus when you're looking at these kind of numbers. Anything under 10%, you're rolling the dice. And so that's part of that conversation with kids. So that was a factor of the pandemic. And the Ivy admit rates, we know also those schools became hyper selective and so forth. And the last thing is test flexible, which in this moment with the pandemic, we're not seeing many schools who are test optional. Test flexible. And normally what that means is they require some testing, but you choose what you want to send, whether it's an AP exam, they want 1 math, 1 verbal, one subject, and you can pick. But ultimately, right now, all these schools, NYU, and they're all test optional right now. So we'll see if schools go back to this test flexible, where you can cherry pick my math from the SAT, my verbal from the ACT, and my IB or my AP from chemistry. And those become my standardized test that you'll use to evaluate me. But right now, everyone's, these schools are optional. So, but we'll see what, it may revert back. And finally, the big news, the big change was this test blind. They're trying to rebrand it as test free, but I think blind is actually more accurate. Blind is they can't see it, even if you send it. So they're not going to look at it. It's not a factor. You can have perfect test scores, and they won't even ever know that. And so test blind, typically there was Sarah Lawrence College, tried it, then went back. There really weren't that many schools that refused to accept or look at test scores. But now there are several. There are fewer than 50 colleges in the country, of the 2,500 4-year schools. So it's a small number, less than 2%. And about 20 colleges said we're doing this permanently. So again, 20 out of 2,500, that's about roughly 1%. And then 1% are looking at pilots to see how it's working. There was some big news when like there's a big research school called Worcester Polytechnic in New York, and they're a good school. And they said, we're going to go for an 8-year pilot and look at this closely. That was a big move. You know, it's like when Chicago went test optional 3 years ago, that was a big deal. Having a school of that caliber with, you know, a STEM focused school saying we're not going to require testing, but now, you know, that's national. And then some of these changes, you may have, I'm sure many of you have heard about California and all of their shenanigans, you know, with testing and all the politics of California. And right now they're trying to figure out, are we going to, you know, use the smarter balance test? Are we going to modify it? Are we going to require testing for our kids out of state or internationals? Or but right now they're not accepting testing. It was because of a lawsuit that was filed. And there was an injunction against test scores because there were several kids who filed suit that they couldn't get their accommodations met, and therefore, you know, it wasn't fair and there was an ADA violation. But ultimately, we'll see what California does. But right now, they're on a no testing path for UC and Cal State. Other schools that are looking at it: Dickinson, Idaho, Reed, St. Xavier, Washington, and then a few other ones that went permanent. They're typically smaller schools: Northern Michigan, Northern Illinois, Loyola. Catholic went, but they aren't as selective. But then Worcester Poly, and then there's St. Mary's in Texas that affects you guys. So again, not a major, you know, swath of the schools in the country, but you know, it's a small portion. So right now, the main game, you know, the main you know, piece you'll be looking at with your kids is test optional. Do we submit? Do we not submit? In which range? I was just on this morning on this Grown and Flown group again, and there are more questions. Parents are asking. My student got a 33, but it's, you know, the mid 50 range is 33 to 35. Do I send or not send? And you see 5 different answers, which is interesting because you're in the bottom of the middle 50 percentile, but it's also a 33 is a good score. But then, you know, those kind of questions are going to be, you know, really a big deal. And so when it comes to the future, if I'm looking at my the great Karnak, and I'm trying to predict where it's going, it seems like this test optional thing, you know, the toothpaste is out of the tube, it's here, and it's not going to go back the way it was ever again. And so we're going to see schools and certain states and certain flagship schools, but a lot of liberal arts schools will never go back to testing. The hyper selectives might, the big states, you know, we're seeing some trickling back in, but it'll never be what it was in 2018. And so about 2/3 of schools expect they'll be optional post-pandemic. There was a pretty broad survey of 207 colleges and admissions offices and directors. And they said, we're going to be in 5 years, 5 years. And about a fourth to about a third of schools are going to require testing. And so we're seeing that with, you know, Austin and, you know, and Georgia Tech and in Florida. About 2/3 predicted they're going to be optional. And then roughly 5%, 10% are going to be test blind. And that was the real question of, are we entering a post-testing world? And this research said, probably not. The post-testing, it's going to be a sliver, 5-10%, and it'll make news when it happens. But the majority of colleges are, if you have good test scores, they can become part of your application. We'll look at them, we'll use them, but we're using them differently than we did before. And if you don't have good test scores, there's a lane for you now. And that lane is actually bigger now than it was pre-pandemic. Because like there was Chicago went test optional, and that was a huge deal when they went, that rippled through our industry. And that was the biggest one since Wake Forest, really. And that was like, you know, 12 years ago. And when Chicago went, they said it was optional. However, the lane that was reserved for kids who had no test scores was about 10%, 12% of kids who got into Chicago had no test scores. About 85% plus of kids had test scores. So there's a lane for you, but it's a pretty small lane. That lane expanded during the pandemic. And the question is, how big will that lane be post-pandemic? Will it shrink? Most likely, but how much? And that's where we don't know. Because a lot of kids didn't submit test scores during COVID for a lot of reasons. Disrupted access, other problems, but you know, it swelled from like 10% to 30, 40%. But the whole thing is, what will the new normal be next year and the year after? And it's probably going to be closer to 20, 25%, but no one can tell for sure. We're speculating here, we're guessing. But my sense is it will be smaller than the pandemic, because that was very disruptive for so many reasons, and that'll be over. And so many colleges, they're waiting. We're trying to figure out, again, the outputs. GPA, how ready were kids? Because there's been a lot of learning loss coupled with grade inflation. And so the question is, how ready are these kids for these rigorous schools? And test scores are really an anchor. Someone called them a ballast to help you keep in check the grade inflation. And they really do reveal something. And that's something even at, there's at Georgia State, where I went for my doctorate, they really use testing to help figure out who needs remedial classes and who does not. Even if you have an A in a class, you have you have your A's in your math classes from high school, but then like you go and get a 1 on the AP. So you may have really got an A for your class, your cohorts are strong, but in terms of knowing the actual material, the content compared to your other national peers, you aren't that skilled. So you have a 92 in the class, but a 1 on the AP. So that standardized test score, you got a 470 on your SAT. They'll say, okay, we'll accept you into Georgia State. However, we're putting you in this remedial class with more support to make sure you don't fail out. We don't want to go by that 92 you had in calculus and put you in a class in Calc 141, and then you just totally collapse. And so standardized testing can help calibrate how much you know compared to your national peers versus, your GPA is how you did versus your class, but there are definitely different grading cultures in different schools. And so standardized testing kind of keeps you honest in many ways because, you can't rig it for your own kids to have higher grades for better outcomes. These numbers don't lie. So when it comes to optional, again, I mentioned like Washington State, they're committing. We like test optional. And there's a reason there, the idea of access, and especially there's, differences in terms of demographic groups doing different levels on different, we have these issues. There was one, I sent you an article, Ginger, earlier about someone saying if someone's using testing at all, it's racist, which is amazing that that idea. Maybe I shouldn't go there with this conversation, but ultimately the idea that if there are differences in groups, then we can't use these metrics, which I fundamentally disagree with at every core level of my being. To me, facts are friendly, data is data, and it tells us different stories, but let's not use data because we aren't a fan of what it's telling us. But for some of these reasons, access, other things, some schools are saying we're committing to this, we're going optional permanently. And we're going to see more of that over time. But one of the key things is when parents come to you and say, we're optional, it does not mean testing that doesn't matter. And that's a major misconception. Oh, it's optional. It doesn't really factor in. If you have strong testing, it's going to be a strength and going to be weighted in your application. Strong test scores matter for schools who are test optional. They're not going to trump other, grades and academic rigor matter more, and they always have. Testing doesn't trump those things, but if you have good test scores, it's one more confirmatory, it's a validating factor that we can trust that 3.9. And then we know what that means, and you got a really strong test score to validate it. Same thing with strong AP scores or strong IB scores. They confirm the grades, and it really, versus other kids don't submit. It's just, it's not as strong in many cases. And Cornell was very clear. They spelled it out. If you don't have test scores, other things matter more, which makes absolute sense. If there's like three legs of a stool or 4 legs of a stool, and you take one leg away, there's more pressure on the other legs, which makes absolute sense. It's an algorithm. It's, and so we look at grades mean this much, your teacher's rec mean this much, your essays mean this much. Testing, if we take testing away, the other things, they'll be heavier naturally. They also said that if you have additional testing apart from the SAT or the ACT, that'll count more. And so we heard from one of our friends, Jamie Hansard, over at Texas Tech, and she said, yes, in the year when a lot of our kids didn't send us SATs or ACTs, any testing we had mattered more. So if you sent us a 5 on an AP or 4, that became part of the conversation. When we were lacking that other detail of, a 31 on the ACT, or whatever it was, a 27. So other testing also matters more in this climate. So the real question becomes, do I submit scores or not submit scores? And so ultimately a weak test score in an optional world, you don't want to send it. If you have a strong score, you do want to send it. If it can provide more context, more strength, and good testing can show you're ready for college level work. And also it can affect merit-based aid. That's a thing that even some schools split on admissions criteria and merit-based aid criteria. And there are schools for whom you can get into school without testing. But if you really want a merit scholarship, testing is still part of the conversation. Okay. And so merit aid, it's a few things. Wabash College, they have a clear matrix. And so as your GPA goes up, your test score goes up, the amount of money they give you goes up. It's simply a lock matrix. If I go from a a 26 to a 27, that's an extra $5,000 off a year. There are schools like this. Not every school does this, but they're very clear. Alabama is a school who's famous for using a ton of merit-based aid, and they've over 100 million in merit aid, and they've transformed their campus. What they've done is they're making a gamble that they're going to bring in a different quality of applicant, and afterwards it'll change. Their graduates. It'll change giving for the next 50 years. They're making this calculus, and so far it seems like it's working pretty well. And they've transformed, like, the academic level of Alabama. It's doubled essentially, using these merits. And they're pulling kids from Texas. They're pulling kids from schools who have applied and gotten to Brown. I mean, because they're giving such generous financial aid. You go to the honors college, and then you apply to the graduate school, and you go to Brown for grad school. That's like my sister. She went to UT Austin for Plan 2. She ended up getting, she got in-state tuition back when it was $2,500 a year. Remember those good days? And so then she got into Harvard, and she got into Duke and everything else for graduate school. And so she saved a mint undergraduate, and that's part of this deal. Like, Alabama's doing this. Will save you a ton undergrad, and then you get a good score on your GRE or GMAT or your LSAT, and go to the good schools after that with the good grades. So rates of submission. Historically, I mentioned to you that the lane for testing for submission was, kids were getting into these schools without test scores, but the lane, Bill Hiss's research out of Bates College found there was about a quarter of kids who were accepted to these schools didn't have test scores. But you can see that, like Wake and American and George Mason, Worcester, Brandeis, a lot of these kids who applied and were accepted sent test scores. It was a pretty big number, though that number plummeted during COVID. A lot of kids did not send their test scores. So we saw that stat of the number dropped to under half of kids sent test scores via the Common App. However, it's important to dig deeper into the nuance. They also had a report that schools who are more selective, well, guess what? And this is for larger schools who are not first gen, private schools who were more selective. So the submission rates did change in terms of who sent test scores. So the schools who were less selective, it was like 44%, but schools who were more selective, it was over that percent. And then public school students, you have schools who are less selective, publics who are less selective. Under half of the kids sent test scores, but the publics who are more selective, 2/3 sent test scores. So be mindful that, even if under half of the kids are having test scores sent, if you're applying to a selective school, more kids are sending their scores in there. And also there are differences by major. So if you are applying to a STEM school, or you want to showcase your math chops, more of those kids, those engineering kids, kids are applying to pre-business kids, pre-med, pre-health. They want to show off their math skills. More of those kids are sending their test scores than if you're applying to a gen ed or undeclared or social work or things like that. And so a lot of our kids trying to showcase their math scores are sending their test scores. And we know for sure that the rates are going to change. And our belief is that submission rates are going to increase, but they're not going to reach what they were in 2018, never again. And we know that, the ACT reported that 2.3 million kids that were tested, and the College Board reported a fairly similar number. There was a drop off last year, but things are moving back to normal. And ultimately, we find that students are going to use more strategy when they send or don't send test scores. There's a question of, did test score submitters have an edge? The early rounds of last year, there's not too much data on this. The schools really aren't reporting this data as openly, but occasionally on Tufts mentioned something on a press release, or Williams, and they didn't see much of a difference. However, Penn and Georgetown did. Penn showed that there was a small advantage for kids who had test scores, and Georgetown showed a pretty robust advantage. They were pretty clear that their acceptance rate was around 11%, but it was only 7% for non-submitters, and closer to like 13 for kids who had test scores. So that's a pretty meaningful difference. And then Jeff Selingo, he's a researcher, author, put forth this data talking to several admissions officers. And it looks, if you look at Emory, for example, the admit rate for kids without test scores was about 8%, with test scores 17%. So that would make you think, there's an advantage here. and Colgate, similar, Duratec, similar, that they are accepting students with test scores at a higher rate. The caveat here is that these students aren't evenly matched. These are, just because their test scores, one has, one doesn't, the pool is different. That isn't, so if you have two kids, one with a 3.8, they both have 3.8s, same academic rigor, same level of activities, good essays, one has test scores, one doesn't, you wouldn't see this massive advantage. There would be probably an advantage, but not double, and what they were saying is the kids without test scores, they were different in other ways too. On average, they may have had, as a pool, as a cohort, lower grades, as a cohort, less rigor, as a cohort. So it's hard to look at that number and say, oh, you have twice the edge. Like, you don't, but there is an advantage, but we don't know how much to discount that number. But there does seem to be an advantage, but I don't know what the number is. There's a question, and Ginger, I'm realizing I'm omitting we have G's and J's. Do you want to rock and roll with this one?
I can, but I'm happy for you to take it.
Do you want me to keep rocking? Or
you keep on rocking, and I'll help you. I'll join in for the Q&A.
Okay, I forgot about this. I'm sorry for that. In terms of, should I try the tests? And part of it is we believe fundamentally that everyone should try and get a baseline test. There's nothing to lose, a few hours of your weekend, and get a baseline score for the ST and the ACT before you decide whether to prep or not prep. Is it worth your energy or not? And then if your scores are close, then prepping may serve you well. If your scores are way below that range for the schools on your list, then I would probably invest my attention in other places. Unless you have a school on your list like UT, but for juniors, you guys are okay. For this year and next year, you're going to have the option to be, to submit or not submit. But if you're applying to Tech or Florida, you'd have to go ahead and take it. And so, but many of you, like I had a student who's looking at pretty good schools, ended up getting a 21 baseline score. And the question is, should I try? A lot of my schools, their middle 50 range is 28 to 32. I have a 21 out of the gate. Is it worth my energy? And it's like, you know what? I would probably put your attention in other places, starting that far below that range, because it's going to be quite a lift to get you even to the bottom of the ranges for those schools. So in that case, for that student, I would say, you know what? Let's save your resources, put them elsewhere. However, the kid opens up with a 26 on the ACT, and the range of their schools is 28 to 30. It's like, you know what? I think with energy, attention, and focus, we can get you up into the high 20s, 30. That puts you in a competitive place. That puts you in that middle 50 range, even on the higher end, some of the schools, which could play to your strengths. So part of it is knowing where you're starting from, which is why, to me, it makes so much sense. Get a baseline, and that'll inform your next steps from there. Then the question is whether do I prep or not prep? Depends upon how big the reach is. Then, and also, is there merit-based aid at some of these schools? That'll also inform, is it worthy? Because for many students, if you prep, there's an investment return. If I go to these schools and then there's a matrix school and I hit a threshold for scholarships, then it's paid for itself. Then the question is, do I submit or withhold? And are the scores, the question to ask yourself is, do I believe my test scores will add value? Do I believe they're going to strengthen my application? Do I want them to see it? And if the answer is no, then you withhold it. If the answer is this will actually strengthen or validate or confirm, then you send it. And that's the calculus. And so there's nuance here, because part of it, we've heard, like, if you're from a part of the country where no one ever sends applications in, and you're your first generation, and you get a 28, like someone said, from like middle Appalachia, we were jumping and doing backflips from someone with a 28, 29, even though, that's below our middle 50 from that region, from certain parts, certain pockets, let's say of West Virginia, we don't get applicants. And so a 28 would actually, you would stand out, but from a kid from, the tri-state, from Connecticut, New York, probably not. That would be the same thing. So part of it, there's nuance to where you're applying from, first gen, not first gen, and just the competitive set of the students you're in your competitive cohort. That is also a factor. But in the grand scheme, so Jeff said, in terms of whether you send or don't send, that he found that when it comes to STEM students, that kids who had test scores applying to STEM and business got in at higher rates. So we're seeing not only, and part of it's interesting, so we have more kids submitting scores if they're STEM, and then kids in STEM programs getting in at higher rates. So it seems like everyone kind of understood that if I'm trying to be an engineer then, getting a 750 on my math or getting a 33 ACT math, that says something. And so the kids submitted more, and those kids were admitted at higher rates for those STEM kids. And Jamie also mentioned, I mentioned her over at Texas Tech, that if you're in the bottom quartile, those scores typically aren't going to help. But if you're in that middle 50 bracket, part of it, the question again is it going to strengthen? And the same thing, Sean Felton over at Cornell. And I asked him, is there a number below which you would not submit? He said, for us, anything below a 650, it's not going to impress our committee because they're used to much higher scores. Their mid 50 range for verbal is 680 to 760, and for math, 720 to 800. That's a middle 50, which means a quarter of the kids have perfect math scores, which is one of the top schools. So for them, he's like, I wouldn't submit anything below that. I would just withhold and go optional. And also he mentioned that scores matter more by certain majors. He mentioned that business and STEM matters, but if you're a fine arts major or performing arts major, it's your audition, your portfolio. These have so much more weight than other things in terms of the academic rigor of the program and so forth. And Rick Clark, he said, if you're in the top half, always send. So, but if you're in the bottom of our middle 50s, like, again, do you want us to see it or not? And if you're in the very bottom quartile, below that mid 50 range, he wouldn't send it. And that really is what's happening, that students in the bottom quartile seem to be withholding their scores. And it seems like what's happening is the middle 50 range for this year is going to be moving to the right. We heard from the Sweet Tea Tour, I believe it was, Ginger, you mentioned, that we got some data from Georgia Tech and UGA. And Georgia, those numbers blew my mind, that it was looking more like Tech or like Emory this year, because a lot of kids who had weak scores didn't send them when Georgia was optional. So that everything shifted up like 50 points. And that was really, I expected a shift of like 20 points, but it was such a dramatic move. And you realize how many kids use strategy and just didn't send their weaker scores. And I'm very curious how it swings back now that scores are required for Georgia. But that's kind of whiplashy and typically when colleges eliminate testing, the requirement, you increase like your average test score by about 25 points. But this year with the pandemic, it was different. And I think popped up like 50 for, some of these southern state schools. So, people are being savvy. They're seeing these numbers and they're just not sending scores if they're in the bottom quartile, which makes a pretty big difference. So, and part of it also is, do I send or not send based on my grade point average? If my grades are stellar, then I want that to be the only conversation. I don't want them to be talking about my amazing grades and rigor and everything else. Do not bring up a modest or a weak test score. If I have this incredible GPA, let that stand for itself. And then, there are definitely students, and a lot of kids, that what Rick was saying is kids who send test scores often on average have really good grades too, because that's the College Board data is pretty clear that 2/3 of kids, your test scores and your grades, they're highly correlated. But then the other third, you have these discrepant, the variances. And so half of those kids, they have much stronger scores than grades. And half of that, third, they have much higher grades and scores. And so part of it is, most kids, good grades, good scores go together. But if you have test scores that are well below your grades, don't send them. But if you have test scores that are above your grades, well, that can strengthen. Makes sense. But also the individual scores matter by section. You may have a 1400 SAT or, a 31 ACT, but you have a really strong math score in there. You have a 33, 34 in math, but only 26 in verbal. But if I want to be an engineer, that 33 math, I want them to see it because that's the important score for my applied major. And so part of it, you may make a different decision based on the other components if you want to really showcase a very strong score in there. And then so that week, one strong, 1 weak, that can be a dilemma for kids. But the whole thing is how strong, and in the packaging of your application, how important is that for, if I'm going to be an English major and I have a weaker math score, okay. I'm applying to, plan 2, my English score matters more. I'm going to be writing a lot and not doing as much math in plan 2. So part of it that can affect, this choice you make. One thing to be mindful of, when you send a weak score, it's hard to ignore. it's going to inform the conversation, whether you like it or not. And we've heard this from, highly selective admissions offices, where someone sends a 1 on their AP exam. And it's like, then they have your, you scored a 93 in that AP Calc class, but you scored a 1 on it. Then suddenly it's like, wow, it calls into question, it could have been, you had an awful day, you were sick, we don't know what happened on that day, but by sending the 1, I'm giving them information that they didn't have before. And it's way better to withhold that and let them dwell in mystery. I have no idea how you did. They didn't send it. It could have been a 4 or 5 or 3, but we have no idea. But by telling someone I got a 1, it's like, better to not ever do that if you can help it. And so the same thing, if you have a really low test score, if I can help it, I'm going to withhold it. So I don't muddy the water of my otherwise good grades and rigor and so forth. And in terms of strategy, treat every school differently. You're not going to have one policy. And we saw this, about 1/4 of kids on the Common App did this. Like the rate of strategy use and submission went from about 4% to about 25, 30%. So things really popped up this year. Kids are getting smarter that, some schools, the scores will help me. Some schools, they'll hurt me. And so every single one is a unique calculus. So that's a meaningful thing. And finally, when it comes to an example, we threw out Swarthmore up in at college in Pennsylvania. So they have a pretty, strong score range. For verbal, it's 680, 750, math, 790. It's a strong range. Now the question then becomes, do I submit or not? So if you're in the top half, if I score above a 1470, send that test score. Don't even blink, don't even think twice, send it in. In the event I score below a 1380 for Swarthmore, barring extraordinary circumstances, you're first generation, you're from a part of the country that no one ever applies, and then otherwise I wouldn't send it. If you're from from Austin or from Houston or Dallas, or so, they have plenty of kids applying from these prominent areas. The real question becomes, if I'm in the 3rd quartile, if I'm in the 1390, 1400 range, and that's going to really hinge upon several things. Am I closer to 1460 than 1380? If I'm just slightly below it, and that can help me, I may submit it. Is there a really strong score in there? Do I have a 750 on math in there that I want to, but a lower verbal, in which case I might send it if I'm applying to a STEM program. If I have amazing grades, I probably don't want to muddy the waters, but if I have only average grades, then a 1420 could help. And so forth. So it's being mindful of these things. There's nuance here. And again, but treat every school differently. I may submit to the public, withhold from the private, and that's quite natural. So we do these things. We help students with academic coaching, of course, test prep. And there's one more thing I'm going to throw out there. We're doing a free PSAT prep rally across the country. We'll be working with thousands of students to get them ready on 9/25, which is yesterday we started. So getting pumped up for the annual prep rally. And if you want to just look it up, you can type in applerouth.com/prep rally, and we'll talk about helping kids get ready for these. We're going to have free sessions for strategy, full-length PSATs. If you want, it's a free resource. So we're offering this to kids all over, to your kids and our, everywhere. All right, that is now 2:44. We have 16 minutes, and we're going to ask questions and have answers. So let's do it.
We have lots of questions. And there were some really great questions that you all had submitted ahead of time, and I want to make sure we talk about those too. We had probably, I would say, like about a half dozen questions asking about the SAT or the ACT. How would someone know which test is right for them? So Jed, if you could speak really briefly to the differences, fundamental differences between the tests and what we think is the best way for a student to determine their path.
No, yeah, for sure. The primary differences, the SAT is about 2 grade levels higher with reading. So you have an 11th grade reading level. There's more advanced content. There's more reading everywhere. It's more of a reading test. You have a little bit easier math. The math focuses more on algebra 2. You have very little focus on geometry. There's very, very little trig, a tiny hint, mostly algebra 2 and algebra. So, some, very light stats. The ACT is going to be more advanced. You have a standalone science section. You have 40 science questions, and it's proper science. You're going to actually have to know about 7 questions of outside knowledge. Whereas on the SAT, they drip in a few questions that are like graphs or reading charts and tables, and there's a science reading passage, but there's not a standalone like proper science section. The level of math is more advanced on the ACT. You have harder math. You have content you never ever see on the SAT, which really goes deep into algebra 2, for graphing and quadratic equations and exponents and things. But on the ACT, they're going to ask you questions about conic sections. They're going to ask you about logarithms, and they're going to ask you the matrix multiplication. They're just more hard math on the ACT on average. The level of reading, again, is a 9th grade level of reading, so it's not as hard, the content. But one trick is it's much faster. The ACT is a speedy test. You have about 40% more time per question on the SAT. So if you need more time and you don't have an accommodation, the ACT is definitely a faster test. So that's one of the key differences. There's more reading, harder reading SAT, speedier, faster ACT, harder math, harder science ACT. Those are some of the primary differences.
Thank you. And I would say that we always encourage students to try both tests in the safety and security of a practice test, where they don't have to publish those scores to anyone, even in the event that a school says, send us your scores no matter what. So there were some schools that were in theory test optional this past year, but we're not really honoring the student-centered approach to test optional and said, if you have scores, you should send them to us. So there's a reason, I think, why some counselors like Lisa and Bob would suggest that students don't sit for an official test until they're really ready to do it. Lisa, would you echo that?
100%. That was actually the only thing, and then I made a note during the session, is we are big fans of practice tests versus going and sitting for a real test until we can see where you're at, so we don't get a way lower score on the end there. Yeah, for
so
sure.
We are glad at Applerouth to be able to provide free practice tests for students who are College Matchpoint clients. So you can sign up through their website or ours and take a practice test and see where you stand. And that'll give you a good sense of which test might be the right fit for you. About a quarter of students tend to score higher on one than the other, but almost every student has just a preference, right? That they've gone through the test and they just kind of I say like one better than the other, maybe dislike one less than the other. There was also a sort of more direct question, is that, does it matter if the student is in a STEM major, say like computer science or engineering? Would the ACT or the SAT offer a better predictive result?
I mean, the level of math is more advanced on the ACT. So you're going to have harder math, more, advanced. There's going to be 4 trig questions, not one, and there'll be this more advanced Algebra 2 content. But we've seen, our computer science kids are they'll do very well in the math on the SAT and the ACT. And so I still would just have them take a practice and get a sense. I wouldn't withhold and just do one without trying the other just in case. But strong math kids will do better. We'll do fine on both tests for math.
Thanks. We also had a group of questions about the timing for when to start prep and the best way to prep. So Jed, if you could talk to each of those things, and Bob or Lisa, if you have any additional comments that you'd make and specific recommendations for your clients.
So timing, during the course of the calendar year, you have 7 SATs and 7 ACTs. So you can take it anywhere during the calendar year. I like getting testing done typically by the end of junior year, if we can do it. And so then in the fall, when you're a senior, you aren't worried about the stuff, because the majority of kids are applying early somewhere, as Lisa and Bob can attest. Applications, and most everyone applies early somewhere these days. And so I don't want to be stressed about testing. I mean, the latest, you have an August SAT, and then you have a September ACT. And then typically, you have application deadlines in October, November. And so you can still keep taking it if you're applying regular for the Jan 1 dates. But for those early dates, I mean, and ideally you knock it all out, testing is done. So you can focus on everything else and the applications and, getting ready for, those Jan 1st submission dates for regular decision. And I like taking it like 2 tests in a row, ideally, if you can. And in terms of a testing plan, the data that we have over we've had 40,000 students. We show that ultimately students tend to see improvements through their third official test. And so part of it, from the first to the second, you have pretty meaningful gains in different sections. And then the second to third test is more of like marginal. You see a pop in one or two areas. But typically the third one is the charm. Some kids are one and done. That's great, especially if they've used lots of practice tests. And some kids are two and done, but on average, we see gains to the third. And the majority of schools in the country, they're going to super score, those SATs, and many will super score the ACT. So they'll cherry pick your best sections and combine them. So that's definitely a reason why if you do a little better here one day on verbal or math or science or writing, it's cumulative. And so by the third test, you have your super score, and that'll be the score they use in committee. And also there's a confidence effect. You kind of get better. It's called a testing effect. That students tend to get a little more confident, more comfortable with every iteration. Especially if they're doing practice tests in between actual administrations. So I think that's it. In terms of preparation, there are different ways to approach it, from the totally self-directed independent study, where you have good practice tests. You have the College Board, the Khan Academy free tests. Online, you have a few tests from the ACT. You'll buy books of practice tests. You might buy, a book of strategies. Then that's
From Applerouth.
Of Applerouth, we have the best book, I believe, on the market. We spent a lot of time on that one. Not that we're biased, but we spent thousands of hours to build our materials. And they're fun too, and they're kind of very well designed. The other piece, though, you have a big group setting, then you have a small group, then there's private one-on-one instruction. And so part of it, you're covering the content. You're kind of teaching more to the mean with a big, larger group. A small private group, you can kind of focus more on the smaller. There's more one-on-one instruction. And some kids supplement the big group or the small group with some private instruction. And finally, there's just pure private. And for students who have really, really high scores or really, really low scores, sometimes private is better, because if I have, a 32 on the ACT, I'm going for 34, you've only missed a few problems. And so covering the full swath of all the material, which you've mastered already 3/4 of it, wouldn't be as efficient for you. And the same thing if I have a much lower score. But in this day and age, if I have a 19 on the ACT, I'd probably be leaning towards going test optional, in the grand scheme of things, in this current climate. But also if you have like really divergent scores, I'm really strong on math, very weak on verbal, versus going to a class covering half and half, I probably want to focus just on the area where I'm weaker. And it depends on the student. I mean, obviously, when you go to a more private model, there's more cost. You have one tutor, one student. But our research, my doctoral research does show it's more efficient, that you can get there faster by focusing only on the content that the student needs versus the class model. That's intuitive, but naturally there's a trade-off of being more efficient versus resources being higher. But yeah, those are the different ways to approach the preparation.
And I would mention that we do offer all of those. We have a self-directed program that's very affordable that students can do at their leisure or at their really fast pace for seniors who are kind of trying to cram, as well as group classes and one-on-one private tutoring. And all of that is available through the magic and power of the internet, which we started doing 10 years before everybody else had to do it because of a pandemic. So we're pretty good at it, I would dare say. We discussed a lot of the sort of to submit or not to submit questions, and we did get several of those ahead of time, but there was one question that I thought maybe we could linger on for a second. Now that students are more likely to have access to standardized testing this year, will it look like you didn't do well if you apply test optional?
And the short answer is yes. Yeah, I mean, naturally, if you don't submit, but part of it, we still don't know. There are a few pockets of the country where testing is hard, and it's more of this out west, but that's clearing up too. I mean, I love seeing that. I watch the curves every night. I go and log in COVID cases US and see that we're starting to come down the Delta wave, which I'm so happy about. I'm sure we all are. I'm delighted. And there's vaccines coming for my daughter and for all your kids. So I think we're hopefully on the end of this one, and things should keep normalizing. And so in the same way, like when you don't send an AP score, there's an assumption you didn't get a 4 or 5, a very natural assumption, because typically if you get a 4 or 5, you send it. However, you don't know, again, if the student for an AP, it's a one-shot deal. Did someone get sick? Did they have a bad day? But with these tests, you have 7 tests during 7 dates. And so if a student does not submit test scores, I mean, there may be a conscientious objector out there. I have not yet met that person who got a 35 and didn't want to send it. Typically, the students who don't send, they feel their scores aren't competitive. However, that's not to say that if you're submitting, you have great grades, great rigor, great recs, everything else, everything's tight, that you can't get a solid spot at a great college. And so I wouldn't sweat it as much. If the scores aren't there, don't worry as much. But it's interesting. The real question becomes, which we don't know the answer. You have 2 students who are matched on everything. They're matched on the academic rigor, GPA, course taking, activities, recs. One has a 15, 20, one has no test scores. What is the advantage? And that's something that no one has given us that answer yet.
I actually would dare say no one could give you the answer, because I think what Bob and Lisa would say too is admissions doesn't work that way. You never like pick between 2 people and say, well, this one or that one. It's not like the eye doctor, right? You go to the eye doctor and which one is better? Number 1, number 2, number 2, number 3. And I think most people think that that's how college applications are read, and they're just simply not. You read one application and you review it on its own merit. And there is no woulda, coulda, shoulda. You don't know what would happen if that student had submitted scores and another student didn't. You just live it one way. All right, we've got 3 minutes left, so we need to go lightning round. Ready?
Do it.
Okay, let's do it. How do you motivate a student who's not that excited to prep?
Wow. Okay. Well, part of it, you dangle a carrot. Obviously, if the school is required for testing, you have them go on a trip and you have them fall in love with the school. And then you say, okay, if you get a good score, you get that. They're like, okay, that's my motivational currency. In the event, or if there's a scholarship and it helps make the money work. And then so then we can afford this school with this merit scholarship. That can be motivating. But it has to be some kind of a pull where the kid gets something. Otherwise, trying to push them if they don't want to do it is going to be very tricky. It has to be some buy-in, because the students, they're adults. They're about to go to college. If they don't want to prep, they live with that. But part of it, if they feel like this could help me, and it's very competitive, and I'm trying to put my best foot forward to a school that's very selective, this is my best shot, let me take it. That student will typically prep.
Awesome. How about some advice for international students?
Testing has been jacked up for international kids. It's really still a challenge in certain markets, though thankfully we're seeing many countries leaving this Delta wave. But over the summer, things were hard for a lot of kids trying to get testing. It's been very hard getting testing for the ACT. It's been a little bit easier for the SAT. The whole computer-based thing has been challenging. But still, it's harder if you can test. It can be beneficial, but colleges are being much more flexible. They understand it's been very challenging, and testing has been deprioritized during the pandemic in Europe, especially.
Terrific, thank you. We talked a little bit about UT Austin, and the other question we had that was about specific schools is these schools that are going test blind indefinitely, someplace like Caltech or the UC system, what are they using instead? If test scores have validity, how are these schools going on without them?
I mean, you can admit a class using only college essays if you want. You could build a class from any one of the 20 variables they use for admission. So part of it, in terms of what do you lose? You'll lose something. That was their own research showed that. But you can absolutely build a class putting more weight on grades and academic rigor. But it's just, you want to have the most robust predictor, the best, calculus. But in the grand scheme of things, they can totally build a class, and they're definitely putting more weight on the other quantitative components. They're the GPA, the academic rigor. Those are the things easy to quantify and count and compare. So those are getting more weight for sure, as well as other things that some schools are using more on the essay, the interview. But definitely the quantitative things that you have definitely weight heavier absent the test scores.
I think that's a great place for us to leave it, that holistic review means we're looking, everyone's looking at the whole student, and whatever is there helps advance the understanding of that student, and whatever's absent is just simply absent. There have always been holes and questions in a student's application. Lots of things have been optional in the past, and not having standardized testing just makes an admissions officer work a little bit harder to get to know a student. And colleges are paying a lot of attention to what is going to happen when those students enroll. So I would expect that we're going to see a lot of data come out as the class of 2020 makes their way through college, the high school class of 2020, that is, makes their way through college. So Lisa and Bob, thank you both so much for inviting Jed and me to be part of this conversation today. Thank your audience and your clients for their great questions. We look forward to following up through the follow-up email that you're doing, Bob. I'm going to send some goodies as well for folks to enjoy and digest, some good links we hope will be helpful. Thank you again. We really appreciate being part of the conversation.
Well, thank y'all so much. We appreciate it. And to all the parents and students who could join us today, thank you. Have a great rest of the Sunday and let us know how we can help. Thanks. Bye now.